American elections are unimaginably expensive. The last time Donald Trump and Joe Biden faced off against each other, they and the candidates allied with their political parties spent more than $14 billion. $14 billion. If you imagine dollar bills lined up end to end, $14 billion would circle the planet Earth more than 50 times. Kind of unimaginable. That's why I use that word. Rob Boatwright is studying how all this unfolds and joins us now. $14 billion. Where does all that money go?
Well, there are a lot of different expenses. Much of it goes into advertising, television, social media, and so on. A lot of the money also goes into what's called grassroots campaigning. So setting up field offices, sending people door to door, political consultants. So a lot of different kinds of uses.
Now, someone has to raise this money. As it turns out, last time, Joe Biden actually outraised Donald Trump, which is kind of amazing because Donald Trump's a pretty rich guy.
Well, Donald Trump doesn't spend his own money on his campaigns. So Biden did outraise him substantially. Hillary Clinton also outraised Biden by quite a bit in 2016. So
that's amazing when you think about it. He doesn't spend his own money on his campaigns. And I gather a substantial amount of the money that's raised doesn't even go to the campaign. It goes to his legal fees?
Well, that's been somewhat controversial. There are three different sort of buckets you might put campaign money in. There is the candidate's campaign fund. There is a campaign fund established by the political party organization, the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. And then there are super PACs, organizations that are technically entirely separate from the candidate, but that spend money, on behalf of the candidate. I would add as well that this $14 billion figure you have probably also includes interest groups that are sympathetic to one candidate or the other. So there are a lot of different places. The money that has been going to Trump's legal defense fund has been coming from his leadership PAC. So that is an organization that is maintained by Donald Trump to do things other than his actual campaign.
You mentioned these PACs, political action committees. They're extraordinary things because, once again, it's not just people reaching into their own wallets. These are organizations that exist essentially to funnel money to the candidates and to the campaigns. How big are they? How important are they? How much do they influence the campaign, do you think?
Well, again, there are different buckets you might think of. Political action committees, or PACs, have existed since the 1970s, and for much of that time, contributions to PACs were restricted to about $5,000 per individual or $5,000 per organization. PACs historically have been a way for organized groups to donate money to candidates. So, for instance, a labor union might set up a PAC. They would give money to a candidate, and everybody would know, those contributions are being given because the Teamsters or the AFL-CIO or so on support me. Since 2010, there have been other types of PACs that are called super PACs, which can't contribute money directly to a candidate, and they cannot communicate in any way with a candidate's campaign. But as long as they fulfill those criteria, they can receive unlimited contributions and they can spend unlimited amounts of money talking about a candidate. So this is not a very efficient way to campaign, but it is a way to channel very large contributions, often in the millions of dollars, into advocacy on behalf of the candidate.
But you mentioned something in passing that's astounding. There is no legal limit to how much money gets spent on campaigns as long as people spend it in the framework that the law allows.
Yes, the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision and in a subsequent appeals court decision a couple of months after that said this is basically free speech, right? We would not put limits on the amount of money that you might spend trying to encourage me to think a particular way or to have a particular type of political idea. So the court argued that there's no legitimate distinction between talking about an issue, right? Encouraging people to feel a particular way about the environment or about abortion or so on, or talking directly about a candidate. Again, as long as you don't pick up the phone and call the candidate and ask that candidate what you should do or tell the candidate what you will be doing.
Now, both candidates, both parties are very proud of the fact that a lot of voters of relatively modest means contribute very modest amounts of money. But do voters of modest means really have any role in this side of the election? I mean, if there's this much big money floating around, does $20 or do $200, do they matter?
I think they do matter. Campaigns are decided by votes. And so if you receive, say, a $20 contribution from somebody, that's a sign that that person is going to vote for you. That's sort of a gateway to you communicating directly to that individual, asking that person for more and more money over time. In addition, because a super PAC cannot communicate with a candidate, it's not clear that that spending is efficient. Whereas if you raise contributions in very small amounts, $20, $50, $100, those go directly to your campaign and you can spend that money in the most efficient way possible. So to give you an example of this, back in 2012, if you looked at the spending by the Romney campaign, again, in those different buckets, and the Obama campaign, it was pretty similar. But Obama did much better at raising money in small contributions from individuals. And therefore, Obama was able to set up field offices in the states. Those field offices could communicate directly with the campaign about what appeals were working and what's not. So all things being equal, if you told me I can raise $1 million in small contributions for you, the candidate, or I can spend $1 million independently on television ads, I'd much rather have that money myself, right? It's a better way for the candidate to control the campaign.
How cynical should people be, though, about the U.S. electoral process? Because so much money is involved and so much of it is raised by organizations that don't really answer to anyone, do what they want, don't communicate with the candidates, but can influence the outcome.
Well, it's certainly a problem. It's a problem for democracy. I think in any regular definition of democracy, a candidate should be accountable for what he or she says in a campaign. And these other organizations are not responsible. Even if you go back to what I said earlier about political action committees as they were established in the 1970s. The AFL-CIO, for instance, is an established organization. People know what it stands for. People know who belongs. So even in that case, in the case of a political action committee that is an ongoing organization that stands for something, they can, to an extent, be held accountable. But a super PAC cannot. And a lot of the people who donate to super PACs, it's not the case that you could say boycott their business or get them to change their views, right? They stand outside of the electoral process. So that's a problem for democracy. It's also a problem for candidates because a candidate cannot necessarily determine what his or her campaign is going to be about. If you think about the 2022 election, there were a lot of Senate campaigns where the actual Senate candidates were outraised 5 or 6 or 7 to 1 by the organizations that were trying to do things on their behalf. And in cases like this, it's those organizations who determine what the campaign is going to be about, not the candidate.
That's astonishing when you think about it. Candidates acting in good faith, running for public office with ideas about what they would like to do if they're chosen to serve in government, and they find the campaign, the issues are taken from them by people they may have never met and by law are not allowed to ever speak to.
Well, it is troubling. It's not clear that other types of systems don't have their challenges as well. In many other countries, there are very strict limits on what groups can say in a campaign. And if the limits are too strict, then a group that has a legitimate issue that they would like the candidates to talk about doesn't have a forum for talking about it, right? If candidates don't want to speak about climate change or whatever, there's not any sort of outside group that can compel voters to think about this or compel the candidates to respond to it.
What do these organizations, what do big donors get for all this money? If they're buying something, what is it they're actually leaving with?
Well, the striking thing is that they don't get anything in particular. Many of the people who have put the most money into politics have been people who had their own kind of idiosyncratic ideas, and they didn't necessarily prosper from it. To take one example, Sheldon Adelson, who is the owner of several Las Vegas casinos, the owner of a number of casinos off the coast of China, was until his death a couple of years ago the biggest contributor to Republican-leaning super PACs. It's hard to argue that he benefited from that financially, right? His businesses did not benefit from it. It's not clear that casinos needed any sort of special provisions from the candidates. And to an extent, his ideological views were taken seriously. He had invested a lot of money in causes related to Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, and that certainly drew the attention of Republican politicians. But for the most part, the people who do this, they're not necessarily the people you think of when you think of wealthy people in America, right? Your Bill Gateses, Mark Zuckerbergs, Elon Musks, and so on. They're not the biggest contributors to these organizations. In a lot of ways, they're people who just sincerely believe they're doing the right thing, and they're not doing it because they expect any particular return.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, there's an organization it's called Open Secrets. They compile a list of the biggest donors. And the names on that list, as you mentioned, they're not familiar to most Americans. I'd never heard of most of them, which makes me wonder if people none of us have ever heard of end up having a very outsized role in American democracy.
They do have a major role. Again, it's not necessarily the case that they personally benefit from it. You can think about this as a hobby, right? I mean, it's maybe a difficult way to think about a democracy, but if you have billions of dollars and you just really care about hobnobbing with politicians or putting your issues out there, maybe this is an outlet for you. It's not efficient, right? You're not going to grow your business. You're not going to turn a profit. But in many of these cases, this is not what folks are looking for. And I want to emphasize as well that it's not necessarily the kind of people who've become villains in the world media. So for instance, Michael Bloomberg is another very large donor to the parties. Michael Bloomberg also spends a lot of money advocating for gun control. Most people on the left in America would applaud his efforts to spend money on gun control, right? They don't put him in the same categories they might put somebody like the Adelsons. But when you look at it in terms of the motivations, it's the same, right? He has an idea that he wants to put forward, and it's an idea that is not necessarily about his pocketbook per se, but about what he thinks American policy should be like.
Other countries have put, with more or less success, other countries have put very strict limits on how much money is spent, who spends the money, how long they can spend it for, how long the election campaign can go on for, rules that the United States, for one reason or another, does not have. Who's better off? I mean, is this a good way to run elections in a country as big and as important as the United States?
Well, I don't think so. There are those who would argue that America is one of the most important countries in the world, and therefore we should take our elections seriously and spend money on them. There are those who argue that the amount of money spent on politics is trivial compared to the amount of money that companies spend advertising potato chips or things like that. So there is that perspective. But for the most part, most other countries in the world have done a better job at making the funding of campaigns more democratic. If you put a relatively low limit on what any individual can contribute, then you guarantee that candidates have the money to campaign, and you guarantee that candidates who are popular have more money, right? That money somewhat corresponds with popularity among the voters, but you prevent anybody from having outside influence. I think one problem that America has that other countries run into as well to a degree is, first of all, America has its elections on a regular calendar. We know when the next election is going to be. Many countries that have been successful at limiting campaign spending are countries where elections are called. So you don't have this whole system of fundraising that operates knowing that the first Tuesday in November is going to be the day by which you spend it. In addition, it is very, very difficult to police outside spending. Many other countries have run into this problem. In the UK, for instance, you can limit what is spent within the UK, but you can't necessarily prohibit somebody who lives in another country, somebody who lives in an offshore tax haven or so on, from spending a lot of money on a campaign. So there are always loopholes, and America, I think, will inevitably always have substantial loopholes, right? Ways for people to spend money outside of the system.
Big loopholes, big money. Rob Boatwright, thanks so much for this.